Outside, the relentless rain poured down. From the gray, gloomy blanket stretching over the roofs of Victorian buildings, the raindrops fell with a heavy, dismal sound. It was chilly and damp on the streets, the wet wind piercing to the bone, a reminder that this was typical English weather. I sat in my office, immersed in the muted light of a kerosene lamp, which barely illuminated the tattered newspaper before me. The headline of the article I was staring at read, "Mystery Murders in Whitechapel Continue." Last night, another young woman's body was found in Whitechapel. Witnesses claim to have seen the shadow of a suspicious man hiding in the fog. The police still have no leads, and the residents of the area are beginning to panic. Who is this mysterious killer, and will they be caught before striking again? Setting the newspaper aside, I pondered as I paced around my office. Why do people kill? This question often arises in my mind. What drives a person to cross the line and become a monster? Envy, greed, anger, all are human vices, but they don't always lead to murder. Perhaps the killer finds some dark satisfaction in the act, a form of power over life and death. Or maybe it's just a manifestation of madness hidden deep within. I walked to the window, gazing thoughtfully at the gray streets where few pedestrians hurried to take shelter from the rain. Memories of my last case surfaced, the grim houses, the trails that led nowhere, and the horror I saw in the victim's eyes. These memories, like shadows, haunted me, giving me no peace day or night. As I continued to wander around the office, I noticed through the curtained window a carriage slowly approaching my house. The dark horses, breathing heavily, stopped, their nostrils steaming in the damp night air. 2 men stepped out of the carriage. One of them, tall and elegantly dressed, clearly belonged to the aristocracy. His walk was measured but showed signs of weariness. The other, shorter and stockier, appeared to be his butler, judging by his strict uniform and confident demeanor. Soon I heard a knock on the door. The dull sounds echoed through the house, interrupting the quiet crackling of the coals in the fireplace. I walked to the door and opened it, letting in the rainy dampness and cold wind. Before me stood the very men I had seen from the window. Lord Charles Blackwood entered the room first. His weary gaze scanned the surroundings of my office. He was tall and gaunt, his face lined with thin wrinkles, evidence of many sleepless nights and experienced worries. There was no hope in his eyes, only deep, hopeless sorrow. He looked as though the weight of the world pressed on his shoulders, and he could no longer find the strength to fight it. His butler followed him. He was of average height, with neatly combed gray hair and attentive eyes. His face expressed restrained concern, as if he was ready to support his master at any moment. "Come in, gentlemen," I said, gesturing them towards the table. Lord Blackwood nodded slightly, his movements slow and a bit uncertain. He sat in the chair opposite me, sighing heavily. The butler remained standing behind, carefully observing his master and the surroundings in the room. My acquaintance with Lord Blackwood began several years ago when I was investigating the case of a missing jeweler. The case was intricate, with every lead ending in a dead end. At some point, I came across his name in the jeweler's client list. Despite his status, the Lord turned out to be a man willing to help justice. He provided information that helped me track down and solve the case. Since then, we had established mutual respect and understanding. "Lord Blackwood," I began, "I assume your visit is related to some urgent matter. How can I help you?" He raised his weary eyes to me, and I felt a wave of his despair and fear wash over him. He began to speak, and from his first words, it was clear that the matter he came with was not just complex, but literally filled with the darkness and horror that had settled in his soul. "Detective Hargrave," he began in a trembling voice, "my daughter, Eleanor, is missing, and I fear that behind this lies something far more sinister than a simple abduction. I've lost all hope of finding her on my own. You are the only one I can trust with this case." I nodded, urging him to continue. "Eleanor disappeared 3 weeks ago," Lord Blackwood continued, his voice slightly trembling. "That evening she was in her room. She said she was tired after the ball and wanted to rest. We left her alone thinking she would just fall asleep. But the next morning she was nowhere to be found. Her room was empty, the windows closed, the door locked from the inside. No one saw her leave, and no one heard anything suspicious. It was as if she had evaporated. I immediately contacted Scotland Yard," he continued. "They searched the entire house, questioned the servants, but found no clues. All the private detectives I hired proved just as helpless. No one could make any progress in the investigation. Then I remembered you, Detective Hargrave, and came straight away." He pulled a folded piece of paper from the inner pocket of his coat and handed it to me. "A few weeks before her disappearance, we started receiving strange letters," the Lord explained. "They contained warnings. Here is one of them. I kept it, read it." I unfolded the letter and read, "Please leave the city as soon as possible. You and your family are in great danger. Do not ignore this warning. Save your daughter and yourself." The words sounded sincere and alarming, as if the author truly cared about the safety of the Blackwood family. I folded the letter and returned it to Lord Charles, deep in thought. This case was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. Someone knew about the impending danger and tried to warn them. Was it an abduction or something darker? "Lord Blackwood," I said decisively, "I will do everything possible to find your daughter and get to the bottom of this dark matter. Let us begin immediately." A faint spark of hope lit up Lord Blackwood's face. "Thank you, Detective. Your help is our last hope," he said with relief. "Please, come with us now." I put on my long dark coat, draping it over my shoulders, then grabbed my hat and put it on, shielding myself from the pouring rain. We descended the creaky stairs, each step echoing in the night silence. Outside, we were met by the cold wind and relentless rain. The horses impatiently shifted from foot to foot, and the carriage awaited us, covered only by a thin roof. We quickly took our places inside. Lord Blackwood sat across from me, and his butler sat next to him, holding a lamp that barely illuminated the dark space of the carriage. London was shrouded in darkness, with only occasional lanterns lighting the streets. The rain beat against the carriage windows, creating a melody that seemed gloomy and endless. We passed through narrow streets and bridges, past houses where lights barely penetrated the curtains. The horses raced forward, their hooves echoing dully on the wet pavement. After passing through several blocks, we found ourselves in a different part of the city. Here the buildings were taller and the streets wider. The carriage stopped in front of a majestic mansion shrouded in darkness and fog. The building towered above us, its facade adorned with marble columns and a massive oak door with metal inlays. The windows, hidden behind heavy curtains, looked like empty eye sockets gazing at us reproachfully. We stepped out of the carriage, and I felt the rain instantly soak through my clothes. Lord Blackwood led us to the door, which his butler opened. We entered the house, and I was immediately enveloped by warmth and coziness, in sharp contrast to the cold, damp weather outside. The mansion's interior was striking in its luxury and sophistication. High ceilings with ornate moldings, massive crystal chandeliers, carved wooden panels on the walls, and a parquet floor gleaming in the light of the lamps created an atmosphere of wealth and grandeur. A light scent of lavender and sandalwood lingered in the air, giving the entire space a subtle touch of comfort and well-being. We ascended a wide staircase, covered with a red carpet that muffled the sound of our footsteps. Portraits of the Blackwood family ancestors hung on the walls, their stern faces and piercing eyes seeming alive, watching our every move. He led me to his daughter's room. We stopped in front of a massive door adorned with intricate carvings. The Lord grasped the handle and opened the door, inviting me to enter. Eleanor's room was spacious and bright, despite the gray day outside. The walls were decorated with floral wallpaper, and the furniture was elegant and refined. In the center stood a large canopy bed adorned with soft pillows and a silk coverlet. By the window was a desk piled with books and papers, next to a cozy chair and a small table with a cup of tea long gone cold. In the corner of the room stood a full-length mirror, and opposite the bed was a dresser with an array of jewelry and perfume bottles. I began my inspection, searching for any clues that might help me understand what had happened. Checking every detail, I noticed the window, firmly closed and locked. The door showed no signs of forced entry. At first glance, everything looked as if Eleanor had simply disappeared without a trace. My eyes settled on a painting hanging above the fireplace. It depicted two men. One was clearly Lord Blackwood in his youth, and the other was slightly younger. "Who is this?" I asked, pointing to the image. Lord Blackwood sighed, his face shadowed by memories. "That is my brother Richard," he replied quietly. "He disappeared many years ago under mysterious circumstances. We never found out what happened to him. Our family has never been the same since." I nodded, contemplating his words. It was a strange coincidence that now Eleanor had disappeared as well. Could Richard somehow be connected to this? I decided that this information might prove important, but kept it at the back of my mind for now. I continued my inspection, checking every corner of the room. My attention was drawn to a small spot on the carpet by the bed. It was barely noticeable and resembled a dried drop of wax from a candle. I thought it might just be a coincidence, a drop that could have fallen while Eleanor was reading by candlelight. Dismissing this detail as insignificant, I continued my search. Lord Blackwood stood by the door, watching my actions with nervous tension. His eyes never left me, as if he was expecting something important to happen at any moment. After examining the entire room, I found no obvious signs of struggle or abduction. But deep down, I knew this case was far more complicated than it seemed at first glance. I turned to Lord Blackwood and said, "Tomorrow, we need to find more witnesses and question the local residents. Perhaps someone noticed something unusual." He nodded in agreement. "Very well, Detective. I will offer you a room for the night. You can stay with us and continue the investigation tomorrow." The next day, I rose early and decided to take a walk around the area. The Blackwood mansion was situated in a district surrounded by shops and stores. However, despite the early hour, there were few people on the streets, and not a single homeless person was in sight. The shops were neat, but seemed lifeless, as if they were afraid to show any activity. I walked, observing the surroundings until I noticed a boy hiding in the shadow of one of the buildings. I beckoned him, and he cautiously approached me. I tossed him a coin, which he immediately rubbed to check its authenticity, then pocketed it. "What do you need, sir?" he asked, his voice quiet and distrustful. "Why are there so few people here?" I asked. The boy glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. "It's because of the mansion," he whispered. "They say there's a monster living there. People are afraid to come close. Folks go missing around it, and that's why everyone stays away." "When does this monster appear?" I inquired. "Around midnight," the boy replied, his eyes widening with fear. "That's when you hear strange sounds and see shadows. Best not to be here at that time." Thanking him, I continued to stroll around the district, contemplating his words. The area seemed even emptier and gloomier after his story. The shop windows looked at me like empty eyes, and the narrow streets seemed to beckon to the unknown. By evening, I returned to the mansion. Finding Lord Charles, I decided to ask him the question that had been troubling me. "Lord Blackwood," I began, "I've heard rumors about monsters living in your mansion. People say that's why folks go missing here and everyone is afraid to come close." He sighed wearily and shook his head. "Those are just tales and superstitions, Detective. There are no monsters here. It's just rumors spread by the locals. I'm sure it has nothing to do with Eleanor's disappearance." It seemed to me that Lord Blackwood lived in his own world, detached from reality, as if the world around him didn't matter. His tired eyes, filled with hopelessness, did not inspire confidence. I decided to wander the estate and talk to the servants to gather more information. The servants were also frightened. I noticed how they avoided meeting my gaze, hurried away, and whispered among themselves. I approached one of the maids I spotted near the kitchen door. "Excuse me," I said, trying to start a conversation. "Could you tell me what's happening here? Have you seen anything unusual?" She looked at me, her eyes full of fear. She replied reluctantly, barely audible. "I'm not allowed to talk about it," she whispered. "We've been forbidden." At that moment, the butler appeared in the kitchen doorway. The maid fell silent and, casting me one last glance, hurried away. This was strange, and I felt there was something important being hidden here. After dinner, I decided to go out on a nighttime patrol to find out what monster was terrorizing the neighborhood. I put on my coat and hat and quietly slipped outside. The night in London was shrouded in fog, and the rain continued to drizzle, creating a melody of drops hitting the pavement. I walked down the street, looking around, then decided to enter the mansion's grounds and explore the garden. The garden was large and maze-like, with winding paths and tall bushes. The atmosphere became eerie as soon as I ventured deeper into the garden. An ominous silence reigned, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. A sense of unease began to envelop me, sending shivers down my spine. It felt like the darkness was thickening, and every bush and tree hid something dangerous. Suddenly I heard strange sounds. They came from the depths of the garden, quiet, almost inaudible footsteps and rustling. I stopped, listening, my heart beating faster. Fear gripped my throat, but I continued walking toward the source of the noise, understanding that this could be the key to solving the mystery. The shadows of the trees seemed alive, reaching out to me as if trying to grab hold. I looked around, feeling fear slowly squeezing me in its icy embrace. But I knew I had to keep going. Step by step, I approached the source of the sounds until I saw a silhouette. A dark figure stood nearby, almost blending in with the surrounding darkness. As soon as it realized it had been spotted, it started running. I gave chase, feeling adrenaline rush through my veins. The pursuit was intense. I pushed through bushes, jumped over tree roots, trying not to lose sight of the figure. The fog and darkness made the chase even more challenging and sinister. The figure flitted before me like a ghost, but I wasn't about to give up. We burst onto the street, where the weak light of gas lamps struggled to penetrate the fog. Our footsteps echoed through the empty streets, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The figure turned down one alley and then another, trying to throw me off. I strained every muscle to keep up, feeling adrenaline pump through my veins. My heart pounded. My breathing became fast and shallow, but I couldn't afford to stop. The fog grew thicker, impairing visibility, but I kept pursuing my target. Finally, I caught up with him. The young man stumbled and fell to the ground, looking at me with desperation. His face was marred by numerous scars, giving him a grotesque appearance. He looked around frantically, clearly searching for an escape route. He was dressed in simple gray clothes, like he had escaped from a poorhouse. Worn-out trousers, a shirt greasy from long wear, and a torn jacket. The number 31 was embroidered on the back of his shirt. "Stop!" I shouted, pulling out my revolver and aiming it at him. "Don't move!" At that moment, the fog rolled in from nowhere, quickly and unnaturally filling the alley. Visibility instantly decreased, and I felt fear grip me again in its icy embrace. The fog was dense, thick, and it seemed to breathe and move like a living thing. Something moved within the fog, the shadows becoming more sinister and alive. I tensed, trying to discern what was happening. Suddenly I heard a scream, piercing and full of terror. The fog began to clear, revealing a horrifying sight. The young man's body lay on the ground, his face twisted in a final scream of pain. I approached and saw that he had been strangled. The marks of hands squeezing his throat were clearly visible. People began to gather in the alley, drawn by the noise. I raised my hand to stop them. "Call the constables," I said firmly. "A murder has occurred here." Within minutes, the constables arrived, and I explained what had happened. We thoroughly examined the crime scene, trying not to miss any details. The constables took my statement, as well as the statements of those who had arrived first. The body was covered and prepared for transport to the morgue. Thoughts swarmed in my head like flies around a light. Who could have killed him so cruelly right before my eyes? Why was he so disfigured? And why did the fog appear so suddenly and unnaturally? Had he escaped from somewhere? These questions tormented me, and I felt that this case was becoming more complex and dangerous. Returning to the mansion, I went to Lord Charles, who met me in the drawing room. I told him what had happened, describing the chase, the sudden fog, and the brutal murder. "Lord Blackwood," I concluded, "this murder happened right before my eyes. It cannot be a mere coincidence." I noticed that the butler, James, standing beside the Lord, was acting somewhat strangely. His eyes darted nervously, and his face showed hidden concern. He was clearly hiding something or knew more than he let on. The next day, I decided to inspect the grounds around the mansion again. The morning was cold and bleak. The fog still hung in the air, giving everything around a sinister tint. Passing by the gates, I noticed an old woman standing before the mansion. Her face was marked by sorrow, and her eyes looked into the distance as if searching for something. I approached her and asked, "Excuse me, madam, can I help you with something?" She turned to me, and I saw deep sadness and weariness in her eyes. "I'm looking for my son," she said quietly. "His name is Thomas. He disappeared 4 weeks ago. I'm afraid something happened to him." "What exactly happened?" I asked, trying to speak as gently as possible. "My son and the Lord's daughter fell in love with each other," she began, her voice trembling. "But the Lord was against their relationship. Thomas was a commoner, and the Lord didn't want his daughter to be involved with someone like him. One night, Thomas disappeared. I searched for him everywhere but found no trace. Do you think Lord Blackwood could be involved in his disappearance?" I asked, trying to understand the depth of her despair. "I don't know," she replied, her eyes filling with tears. "But ever since Thomas disappeared, I feel that something is wrong. People say strange things happen here, that someone or something lives in this mansion and brings misfortune. This woman's story added another puzzle to my investigation. Thomas, a commoner, and Eleanor, the Lord's daughter, had fallen in love but were separated. Now both had disappeared, and the clues led to the very heart of this dark mansion. I felt that uncovering this mystery might help me understand what was truly happening here and who or what was behind these disappearances. I decided to head to the market, hoping to find a couple of street urchins who could help me with surveillance. The market was a lively place where the voices of vendors and buyers mingled. The smells of fresh produce and spices filled the air. Walking past the stalls, I noticed two boys who were clearly looking for a way to earn their keep. I approached them and quietly said, "Boys, I need your help. I'll pay you for a job." They looked at me with distrust, their eyes expressing fear and caution. "What do you need?" one of them asked, slightly older than the other. "I need you to watch the butler from the Blackwood mansion if he leaves the house," I replied. "I'll pay you for it." They exchanged glances, and the younger boy shook his head. "We've heard about the monster," he whispered. "No one wants to go there." I understood that the rumors of the monster scared them, so I pulled a few coins from my pocket and handed them to the boys. "I'll give you more," I said. "Just watch and report back if you see anything suspicious." Greed overcame their fear, and they agreed. "All right, mister. We'll do it." After that, I spent the day searching for clues, questioning the local residents and trying to find any thread that might lead to a breakthrough. But it was all in vain. No new leads. Returning to the mansion in the evening, I had dinner and decided to inspect Eleanor's room once more. Taking a lamp, I headed upstairs. The room greeted me with the same eerie silence. The lamp's light cast long shadows that danced on the walls, giving the place an even more sinister look. I came across the wax stain on the carpet that had caught my attention the first time. This time, I decided to move the carpet and inspect the floor beneath it. With difficulty, I shifted the heavy carpet and discovered a barely noticeable seam in the floor. "There's something here," I whispered to myself. Using a knife, I carefully pried at the seam, trying not to damage the wood. Finally, after several minutes of effort, the board gave way, revealing a hidden door. It opened to a narrow passage leading down into the darkness. The lamp's light penetrated the narrow passage, illuminating old stone steps descending into the gloom. The passage was cramped and damp, the walls covered in moss and mold. I felt my heart beat faster, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Fear and curiosity mixed within me, pushing me forward. I slowly descended the steps, holding the lamp before me. Each step echoed dully, as if the place was coming to life beneath my feet. The air was stale and cold, the smell of dampness filling my nostrils, heightening the sense of anxiety. The passage led to a narrow corridor, its walls covered in cobwebs. I walked slowly, listening to every sound, trying not to miss a single detail. The feeling that I was on the brink of discovering something important did not leave me. Suddenly, I heard a rustling ahead, and a chill ran down my spine. I froze, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it was quiet all around. I continued moving forward, feeling fear gradually give way to determination. I needed to find out what this passage concealed and learn what really happened to Eleanor and Thomas. The passage led me lower and lower, and soon I found myself in a spacious room. Using the lamp, I illuminated the space and realized that it was likely a basement. The walls were made of rough stones, and the ceiling was low, supported in places by wooden beams that creaked under the weight of time. In the corner of the room stood an old, slightly rusted bed with a thin mattress and a tattered blanket. Next to the bed was a small wooden table, covered with books on chemistry and physics. Their worn covers and yellowed pages indicated frequent use. On the shelf above the table stood more books, including works by Jules Verne. An old, worn carpet, stained and frayed, lay on the floor. Against the wall stood a wardrobe with simple but neatly arranged clothes. Beside it was an old chest, covered in dust, as if it hadn't been opened in a long time. Childish drawings hung on the walls. One depicted a house with tall windows and large doors. Another showed strange creatures and fantastic worlds. It seemed that someone had tried to escape reality into a world of imagination and dreams. Carefully examining the room, I suddenly noticed tracks on the floor that alarmed me. They were deep scratches, as if made by the claws of a large animal. They clearly didn't belong to a dog. The tracks were much larger and deeper, as if someone with great force had clawed the stone floor. A sense of unease gripped me. I continued my inspection and discovered a couple more narrow passages in the walls, leading into the darkness. Suddenly, from one of them came a noise, accompanied by a low growl. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and my heart began to race faster. Fear gripped me, and I realized that something was approaching. Without thinking long, I jumped into one of the passages. I crawled through the narrow corridor, holding the lamp before me. The space was so tight that I could barely move. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps and a piercing growl behind me. Something big and menacing was pursuing me. Adrenaline surged through my veins, fear driving me forward. The corridor suddenly widened, and I found myself in the city's sewer system. The air was filled with a musty smell, the walls covered in slime and mold. I realized I needed to hurry if I wanted to survive. I ran, glancing back, and saw a huge creature, resembling a wolf, emerging from the passage. A lycanthrope, the thought flashed through my mind. The creature was enormous, its furry body a mass of muscles and rage. Its eyes glowed with a fierce fire, and its fangs gleamed in the light of my lamp. I felt a chill run down my spine, and fear gripped me in its icy embrace again. "Damn!" I exclaimed. The creature lunged at me. I drew my revolver and began firing, aiming for its head and chest. The bullets hit their mark, but seemed to do little harm. The sound of gunshots echoed through the sewer tunnels, but it didn't stop the beast. Ahead, I saw a ladder. It was an exit. Struggling to overcome my fear, I sprinted toward it, feeling the creature closing in. My heart pounded, my lungs burned from lack of air, but I couldn't stop. Reaching the ladder leading upwards, I began to climb quickly. The ladder was slippery and rusty, but I clung to every rung, trying not to slip. Reaching the top, I pushed open the hatch and emerged onto the surface. The night had already fallen on the city, and I found myself on an empty street, dimly lit by gas lamps. The creature dared not pursue me further. Looking around, I realized I was in the market district. I breathed heavily, feeling the adrenaline gradually leave my body, giving way to fatigue and relief. I could hardly believe what had happened. The rumors of a monster, which I had found ridiculous, suddenly turned into a terrifying reality. The lycanthrope that had pursued me in the sewer was too real, and this fact cast a new shadow on the events. Returning to the mansion, I decided not to tell the Lord about what had happened. My story of a monster would likely provoke only doubt and mistrust. The next day, the two boys I had hired to follow the butler came to see me. They looked excited and a little scared. "Mister, we saw something," one of them said, glancing around nervously. The butler went to a suspicious place. "Where exactly?" I asked, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. "To the old abandoned factory that belongs to Lord Blackwood. It's near the mansion." "Here it is," I muttered, realizing that this information could be the key to solving the mystery. All right, thank you. Here's your reward. I gave them the money and headed back to the mansion, pondering how to share this information with the Lord. Finding a moment when we were alone, I told him everything in detail. The Lord was shocked and couldn't believe that his trusted man could betray him. James? But he's been with our family for many years. It's impossible, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Nevertheless, I suggest we follow him, I insisted. This might help us understand what's going on. In the evening, we decided to act. When night fell and the mansion was plunged into silence, we saw James quietly leave the house. We followed him, trying to remain unnoticed. He walked confidently, avoiding well-lit streets and choosing the darkest and narrowest alleys. We followed him at a safe distance, trying not to make any noise. The fog once again enveloped the city, giving everything a sinister tone. Finally, James reached the old abandoned factory. The building loomed before us, dark and half-ruined. Its windows were broken, and the walls covered in moss and graffiti. The butler looked around before entering. "We must be careful," I whispered to Lord Blackwood, who looked visibly shaken. We quietly followed him, trying not to give away our presence. Inside the factory, there was silence, broken only by our cautious steps. The air was filled with the smell of dampness and decay. We walked down a long corridor until we heard muffled voices. Stopping at a corner, we cautiously peeked around and saw James talking to someone. Their faces were hidden in shadows, but it was clear they were discussing something important. We waited until the butler and his companion parted ways. James went in one direction, and the suspicious man headed further into the factory. We quietly followed the man, trying not to reveal our presence. The factory was dark and abandoned, the walls covered in moss and rust, and the air was filled with a musty smell. The man descended a creaky staircase into the basement, and we carefully followed him. Reaching the bottom, we found ourselves in a narrow corridor dimly lit by lamps. We walked down it, and as we progressed, doors to various rooms opened before us. In some of these rooms, people were chained. Old men, women, and children. They all looked emaciated and exhausted, devoid of strength. Their faces expressed hopelessness and fear. They were dressed in the same simple gray clothing as the young man I had seen dead in the fog. "My God," whispered Lord Blackwood, his voice full of horror and despair. I readied my revolver, staying on alert. We continued down the corridor, trying not to attract attention. Ahead, we saw an entrance to a large room resembling a laboratory. It was filled with various tools and equipment, among which large glass capsules stood out, filled with liquid. Inside these capsules floated monsters, similar to the one I had seen earlier. They were lycanthropes. Their huge, furry bodies, sharp claws, and menacing eyes looked terrifying. 2 men worked in the laboratory. One was dressed in work clothes, dirty and worn, with tools hanging from his belt. The other wore a robe and a bird-like mask resembling a raven. The mask completely covered his face, giving him a sinister appearance. I raised my revolver and commanded, "Raise your hands." They turned, their eyes widening in surprise. The worker, trembling, raised his hands, but the man in the mask remained calm. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my revolver ready. "We are those who serve the cause of science," replied the man in the mask. His voice was deep and cold. I approached the man, ready for anything. Tearing off his mask, I heard Lord Blackwood gasp in surprise. "Richard? You're alive? How can this be? I thought you had disappeared." The man, Lord Blackwood's brother, smirked and spoke in a cold voice. "Of course, I made everyone think I was dead. I knew you wouldn't leave me alone and let me conduct my research." "But why? Why did you do this?" Lord Blackwood asked in despair. You're a fool, Charles. Our family has studied science and human enhancement for generations, but you decided to discard all that, considering it foolishness. I was loyal to our ancestors and continued the research, which was grand. We sought ways to improve human nature, to create superhumans. Lycanthropy turned out to be the perfect solution, a fusion of man and beast to achieve unparalleled strength and endurance. But you weren't interested in that, and you renounced our family's legacy. So I left, faking my death, to continue our ancestors' work without your interference. And what about Eleanor? What did you do to her? I asked, trying to stay calm. I needed material that was best suited for transformation, Richard answered coldly. And it had to be someone from our lineage, so I had to take her. Lord Blackwood collapsed to the ground, lamenting. No, my daughter. My daughter. She made a good subject. Too bad she escaped, Richard said with a slight smirk. But we can't complete our research without her. So excuse me. Thomas, come out. A monster emerged from a nearby room. He was taller than a human, covered in stitched patches and embedded with various devices. He looked like Frankenstein's creature, but with more mechanized and sinister details. His body had metal plates and tubes connecting different parts. Smoke started to emerge from one of the tubes, filling the room. That's the guy his mother was looking for, I realized. He's the culprit behind that murder. The monster slowly approached us. I started shooting at him, but the bullets only bounced off the metallic parts of his body. He continued to advance, and more smoke began to pour out of another tube, filling the room with a poisonous cloud. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Lord Blackwood's hand. We ran down the corridor, trying to get away from the monster. He began to catch up with us, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. We burst outside, where the night air was fresh and cold. Suddenly, a werewolf jumped out of the shadows and attacked Thomas. It was so unexpected that we turned around abruptly, watching them with open mouths. They engaged in a brutal fight. The werewolf, covered in thick fur and with enormous fangs, clawed and bit into the monster's body. The monster, despite his mechanical parts, fought with incredible strength. He struck the werewolf with his metallic arms, tearing chunks of flesh and blood. The werewolf growled, fiercely resisting, and delivered several powerful blows to the monster's face and chest. The monster seemed invulnerable. His mechanical parts protected him from most of the blows, and the smoke from the tubes created a barrier that the werewolf struggled to break through. However, the werewolf did not give up, and his rage only intensified. The battle lasted for several minutes, but it felt like hours. Eventually, the monster stepped back, and at that moment Thomas, as if coming to his senses, stopped for a moment. His eyes met the werewolf's, and he cried out plaintively, "Eleanor!" The werewolf, pausing for a moment, looked at Thomas. Then it roared and continued the attack. Realizing the horror of what was happening, Thomas grabbed an iron pipe lying nearby, and with incredible strength plunged it into the werewolf. The werewolf howled in pain, and its body began to change. The fur started to disappear, the claws and fangs retracted, and before us appeared a young woman, Eleanor. She, exhausted and wounded, lay on the ground, her face pale but expressing relief. Thomas, with despair and pain in his eyes, looked at her. "Forgive me, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice trembling with grief. "I couldn't leave you like this." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She tried to say something, but her strength was leaving her. Understanding that her suffering must end, Thomas tightened his grip on the iron pipe and drove it deeper into Eleanor's heart. She closed her eyes forever, her face frozen in peace. "No, my daughter," whispered Lord Blackwood, his voice shaking with grief. I bowed my head, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Thomas turned and ran back to the laboratory. I stood there, unsure of what to do, but then decided and followed him. When I reached the laboratory, I was met with a horrifying scene. Thomas was holding the bodies of 2 strangled people. Goosebumps ran down my spine. Thomas turned and said, "Get the people out. You don't have much time. Everything will explode soon." I looked around and noticed a device in the corner, quietly ticking. Realizing the danger, I swore and ran back. On the wall, I saw a bunch of keys hanging on a hook. Grabbing them, I started freeing the prisoners from their cells. They were emaciated and terrified, but they understood this was their only chance for salvation. "Faster! Faster!" I shouted, freeing one after another. We ran outside, and I grabbed Lord Blackwood's hand, dragging him away from the factory. He was in shock and barely moved his legs, but I couldn't let him stay there. As we got to a safe distance, a deafening explosion rang out. The factory blew up, and a fireball rose into the sky. The blast wave knocked us down. I covered my head with my hands, trying to protect myself from the debris. When it was over, I lifted my head and saw the destroyed factory. The fire still raged, but the main danger had passed. Lord Blackwood sat on the ground, his face streaked with tears. "No, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice shaking with grief. I turned and saw the freed prisoners. They were shocked and exhausted, but alive. We had done everything we could. After the explosion, we slowly regained our senses. Lord Blackwood sat on the ground, tears streaming down his cheeks, his grief indescribable. I approached him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "We need to go, Lord Blackwood. There's nothing more we can do here." The freed prisoners also began to recover. Their eyes expressed a mix of horror, exhaustion, and hope. I approached them and said, "We need to find a safe place. Follow me." We headed to the nearest police station, where I explained the situation. The constables received us with surprise and concern, but soon began to act, helping the freed prisoners and providing them with first aid. Lord Blackwood was in a state of deep shock, and I knew it would take time for him to recover from this tragedy. His daughter was dead. His brother turned out to be a monster. But despite all this, he found the strength to express his gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "Without you, it would have been much worse." "I did what I had to," I replied, "but I'm sorry for your loss." The days following the explosion were filled with investigations and interrogations. The police began to clear the rubble of the factory, gathering evidence and trying to understand the full extent of the mad experiments Richard had conducted. The secrets surrounding the Blackwood mansion gradually began to unfold. I also found time to meet with Thomas's mother. Her heart was broken, but she was grateful that the truth had finally come out. "Thank you, Detective," she said with tears in her eyes. "My boy can now rest in peace." Finally, I returned to my office. Outside, the rain was pouring again, typical English weather. I sat at my desk, reading the newspaper and reflecting on everything that had happened. The headlines were full of news about the exposure of horrific crimes and the heroic rescue of the prisoners. Setting the newspaper aside, I wandered thoughtfully around my office. My thoughts returned to the philosophical question: why do people kill? What drives them to cross the line and become monsters? Envy, greed, anger. All these are human vices, but sometimes there is something more, dark and unexplored behind them.